Did you hear what she just called me? Someone whispered behind a champagne glass, and I did hear it, clear as crystal, carried across the soft music and polite laughter, my daughter-in-law's voice slicing through the room like it belonged there, like cruelty had a place at my son's wedding. I can't believe Daniel expects me to sit near that pig all night, she said, and for a moment, just a moment, the world didn't shatter the way you might expect. It didn't spin or collapse, it simply paused, like a held breath that refused to release. I adjusted the silk sleeve of my navy dress, the one I had chosen weeks ago after standing in front of my closet longer than I care to admit, wanting to look dignified, appropriate, proud, the kind of mother a groom would be honored to walk down the aisle for, and then I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because something inside me had already shifted long before she opened her mouth, something she couldn't see. Not yet, the ballroom at the Grand Willow Hotel glowed in warm gold light, every table dressed in ivory linens, every chair wrapped in satin, the kind of wedding people call timeless when they want to justify how much it cost. I had arrived early, of course, mothers do, watching the staff place centerpieces, checking my reflection in the mirrored walls, making sure not a single strand of my silver hair was out of place, because today mattered. Today was supposed to be about love, about family, about the life I had spent decades building quietly in the background, finally stepping into the light through my son. Daniel had always been my steady one, the boy who used to hold my hand in grocery stores, who once told me at age 8 that he'd buy me a house by the lake someday, and I believed him, not because of the house, but because of the way he looked at me when he said it, like I was the center of his world. Somewhere along the years, that look had faded, replaced by quick nods, shorter phone calls, conversations that felt more like obligations than connections. And then Vanessa entered his life, bright, polished, always smiling just a second too long, her laughter a little too sharp at the edges. I noticed it the first time we met, the way she assessed a room before settling into it, the way she spoke to people like she was already deciding their worth. But I told myself I was being unfair, that love changes people, that maybe Daniel had found someone who would make him happy in ways I couldn't understand. So I tried, I really did. I attended every engagement dinner, every bridal shower. I complimented her choices, her dress, her taste. Even when I could feel the distance she carefully maintained, like an invisible line I wasn't meant to cross. And today, as I sat at the edge of that perfectly arranged reception hall, hearing her words echo louder than the string quartet, I realized something else entirely. This wasn't a moment. It wasn't a slip. It was a truth she had been holding all along. And still, I didn't react. I didn't stand up, didn't confront her, didn't give the room the scene it almost seemed to be waiting for. Instead, I reached for my glass of water, took a small sip, and let the quiet settle around me. Because what Vanessa didn't know, what none of them knew as they laughed and toasted and celebrated under those golden lights, was that this wedding wasn't the moment my life changed, that had already happened 3 days ago, in a quiet office overlooking downtown Chicago. When I signed a document that would make every word she just said the biggest mistake of her life, I had spent years believing that respect in a family was something that grew naturally, like a garden you watered without thinking, something that would be there when you needed it most. But as I sat there in that ballroom, listening to the soft clink of silverware and distant laughter, I realized how carefully that illusion had been taken apart piece by piece. Not overnight, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, quietly, in ways that were easy to ignore until they were impossible to deny. The first time I noticed it was almost 2 years ago, at a small dinner Daniel and Vanessa hosted in their townhouse just outside the city. I had brought a homemade pie, still warm, the way Daniel used to like it when he was younger, and I remember standing in their kitchen, waiting for him to take a bite and smile the way he used to. But instead, Vanessa laughed lightly and said they were trying to cut back on sugar, her tone polite, her eyes not quite matching the warmth of her voice. Daniel nodded, distracted, already looking at his phone, and I told myself it was nothing, just a change in habits. People grow, people change. I adjusted, I always adjusted. Then there were the holidays. Thanksgiving moved to her parent house without much discussion. Christmas shortened into a quick lunch instead of the long, slow day we used to share. I would receive messages instead of calls, invitations that felt more like formalities than genuine gestures, and each time I convinced myself it was temporary, that I just needed to be patient. that love did not disappear. It simply looked different over time, but the truth was, something else had been growing in its place, something colder, more deliberate. I could see it in the way Vanessa would introduce me to her friends, always with a slight pause, as if deciding how much of me to reveal. "This is Daniel's mom," she would say, never using my name unless asked, and even then, it sounded like an afterthought. I noticed where I was seated at gatherings, always just a little farther away, never at the center, never quite included in the conversations that mattered. I noticed how decisions were made without me, plans finalized before I even heard about them. And Daniel, my son, the boy who once needed me for everything, began to mirror her distance in small, almost invisible ways. He stopped asking for my opinion, stopped sharing the details of his life, and when he did speak, it felt rehearsed, as if he was choosing words carefully, not out of respect, but out of caution, as if there was something unspoken standing between us. I remember one afternoon when I called him just to check in, something I had done for years without thinking, and his voice was polite, but distant. He said he was busy, that he would call me back, but he never did, and I sat there in my living room, phone still in my hand, realizing that the silence afterward felt heavier than any harsh word ever could. And yet, even then, I did not confront it. I did not push, because I believed that maintaining peace was more important than demanding clarity, that if I remained steady, if I remained kind, things would eventually return to what they had been. But sitting at that wedding, hearing Vanessa's voice without the filter of politeness, I finally understood that this was never about misunderstanding. It was about how she had always seen me, and perhaps how Daniel had learned to see me too, as someone easy to move aside, easy to overlook, someone who would not make a scene, someone who would simply smile and accept whatever space was left for her. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to correct that perception, because 3 days ago, in that quiet office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a skyline stretching for miles, I had already stepped into a role where being overlooked was no longer an option, and they were still living in a version of me that no longer existed. The moment itself came not with a grand announcement or a spotlight, but in something so ordinary that no one else in that room would have thought twice about it. A simple vibration against the inside of my handbag, subtle, almost polite, the kind of interruption most people would ignore during a wedding reception. But I did not ignore it. I never had the luxury of ignoring small details. Not in the life I had built, not in the work I had done. I placed my glass carefully on the table, smoothing the napkin across my lap as if nothing at all had changed, and then I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up with a name I recognized instantly, not because it appeared often, but because it never appeared without purpose. Richard Reed. It read, and for a brief second, I let my eyes rest on it. Not out of hesitation, but out of quiet acknowledgement, as if I were greeting a reality that had been waiting patiently for its moment to step forward. I answered the call with the same calm tone I had used for decades in rooms far less forgiving than this one. "Margaret speaking," I said, my voice steady, measured, untouched by the laughter echoing around me. His voice came through clear and direct, the way it always had, no unnecessary words, no wasted time. He spoke about final confirmations, about the transition that had been set into motion days earlier, about the announcement that would be made first thing Monday morning. And as he spoke, I could feel the weight of those words settle into place, not as something new, but as something earned, something that had been building quietly behind the scenes while everyone here had been focused on centerpieces and seating charts. I responded briefly, confirming what needed to be confirmed, acknowledging what needed to be acknowledged, and when the call ended, I placed the phone back into my bag with the same care I had taken when answering it. No rush, no urgency, just a quiet completion of something significant. I looked up then, letting my gaze move across the room, over the polished floors and carefully arranged tables, over the guests who were smiling and talking and celebrating a future they believed they understood. And then my eyes found Vanessa again, standing near the bar, laughing with a group of her friends, her posture relaxed, confident, entirely unaware of the shift that had already taken place beyond her line of sight. There was something almost remarkable about it. The way she carried herself, as if the world were firmly arranged in her favor, as if the roles were fixed and unchangeable, as if I would always be the woman seated slightly apart. the one to be tolerated rather than respected, and I realized in that moment that her confidence was not strength, it was assumption, built on a version of me that had allowed itself to be underestimated for far too long. I did not feel anger as I watched her. Not the kind that demands immediate reaction. What I felt instead was clarity, the kind that comes when all the scattered pieces finally align into a single, undeniable picture. Because 3 days ago, when I sat across from a board of directors in a quiet office overlooking downtown Chicago, I was not the woman she believed me to be, and tonight, as I sat quietly at my son's wedding, listening to the music and the laughter and the subtle echoes of disrespect, I understood something even more important, the moment of recognition, the moment when she would see me clearly for the first time, was no longer something I needed to create. It was already on its way, scheduled, inevitable, and far more powerful than anything I could have said in response to a single careless word the music shifted into something slower as the evening moved forward, a soft instrumental that filled the spaces between conversations, and I watched as guests began to gather closer to the center of the room, drawn toward the dance floor where Daniel and Vanessa stood side by side, smiling for photographs, their hands linked in a way that looked effortless, natural, exactly as a wedding should feel from the outside, and for a moment, I allowed myself to see it the way everyone else did, the polished surface, the illusion of harmony, the carefully arranged story of two people starting a life together. But I had lived long enough to understand that what is presented is rarely what is true, especially in rooms where appearances matter more than honesty. I remained seated, my posture straight, my expression composed, the kind of stillness that often goes unnoticed because it does not demand attention, and yet from where I sat, I could see everything. The way Vanessa leaned slightly toward Daniel when others approached, subtly guiding the conversation. The way she answered questions on his behalf before he could speak. The way he allowed it without hesitation, as if it had become second nature, and I realized that what I had once mistaken for partnership was something else entirely, something quieter, more controlling, a shift so gradual it had blended seamlessly into their lives. I noticed the small details, the ones most people overlook, the brief flicker of uncertainty in Daniel's eyes when he glanced in my direction and then quickly looked away, the way his shoulders tensed just slightly when Vanessa laughed a little too loudly at something one of her friends said, the way he adjusted his cufflinks not because they needed adjusting, but because he needed something to do with his hands, and in that moment, I understood that the distance between us had not been created in a single decision. It had been shaped over time, reinforced by silence, by avoidance, by a series of choices that were never spoken out loud. And yet here we were, standing on opposite sides of a room that was meant to bring us together. I could have stood up then, could have walked across the floor, could have said something that would have cut through the music and the laughter and forced everything into the open, but I did not because I no longer needed to prove anything in that space. I no longer needed validation from people who had already decided who I was. Instead, I folded my hands neatly in my lap and watched as the photographer positioned them for another picture, instructing them to turn slightly, to smile, to look at each other as if nothing else existed, and they did, perfectly, convincingly, as if they had rehearsed it, and perhaps they had. Perhaps this entire evening had been a performance carefully curated down to the smallest detail, and if that was the case, then I had no intention of interrupting it. Not when the truth would reveal itself far more effectively without my involvement. I glanced briefly toward the large windows lining the far wall, the city lights beyond them stretching out into the distance, steady and constant, a reminder that life continued far beyond this single room, beyond this single night, and I thought again of that office, of the documents signed, of the decisions already set in motion, and for the first time since the evening began, I felt something settle into place completely, not anger, not sadness, but certainty, because everything that needed to happen next was already unfolding, not here under the soft glow of chandeliers, but in boardrooms and offices and conversations that carried weight far beyond this celebration. And as I turned my attention back to the dance floor, watching Vanessa smile with effortless confidence, I understood that the version of this story she believed she was living was about to change in a way she could not anticipate. Not because I would force it to, but because it already had. It was during the toasts that everything became even clearer, not because of what was said, but because of what was carefully left unsaid. The best man spoke first, a polished speech filled with stories that painted Daniel as successful, driven, admired, a man who had built a life worth celebrating. And I listened, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, noticing how easily years of quiet sacrifice could be replaced with a version of him that did not include where he came from. Then Vanessa's maid of honor took her place, her words bright and enthusiastic, describing Vanessa as strong, ambitious, someone who always knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. The room responded with laughter and applause, as if determination and control were the same thing, as if no one could see the difference. And then, finally, it was Vanessa's turn. She stood with effortless confidence, holding her glass just high enough to command attention without appearing to try, her voice smooth, practiced, the kind of tone that carried well in a room like this. She spoke about love, about partnership, about building a future together, and for a moment, she even mentioned family, briefly, vaguely, carefully, avoiding specifics, as if the word itself was enough without needing to acknowledge the people behind it. I noticed how her gaze moved across the room, touching on certain guests with intention, lingering where it mattered, and passing over others without pause. And when her eyes brushed past me, there was no hesitation, no recognition, just a brief acknowledgement that I existed, nothing more. And I realized then that this was not simply distance or discomfort. It was something far more deliberate, something that had been decided long before this night. Daniel spoke last, his voice quieter, less certain, and for a moment, I heard something familiar in it, a trace of the boy he used to be. He thanked Vanessa, he thanked her family, he spoke about their future, about the life they were building together, and then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned me, a single sentence, polite, appropriate, carefully placed, so it would not disrupt the flow of everything else. The room clapped, the moment passed, and just like that, years of motherhood were reduced to a line in a speech that no one would remember by morning. I did not react. I did not shift in my seat or let my expression change. I simply listened because by then I no longer needed acknowledgement from that stage. I no longer needed to be included in their version of events. The truth had already taken shape elsewhere. In rooms where words carried consequences, where decisions were not softened by music or applause, I picked up my glass, taking a small sip as the speeches ended and the room began to settle back into conversation, and I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection, not on what had been lost, but on what had been revealed, because there is a difference between being overlooked and being seen clearly for the first time, and tonight I had been given that clarity without having to ask for it. Vanessa returned to her seat beside Daniel, leaning in slightly as she spoke to him, her voice low, her expression composed, as if everything had unfolded exactly as she intended, and perhaps, in her world, it had, but I understood something she did not. Control is only real when it is not challenged. And she had never considered the possibility that the person she dismissed so easily might exist outside the narrow role she had assigned. I set my glass down gently, smoothing the front of my dress once more, a small, deliberate gesture that grounded me in the present. Because while the evening continued around me with its laughter and celebration and carefully curated happiness, I knew that this was only one part of a much larger story, one that had already moved beyond this room, beyond this moment, and into a space where titles carried weight, where names mattered, and where the assumptions made tonight would not hold up under the light of what was coming next. By the time dinner plates were being cleared and the room had softened into that comfortable hum of conversation, I had already stepped outside the version of the evening everyone else was still living in. Not physically, not yet, but mentally. I was somewhere else entirely, back in that office 3 days earlier where everything had quietly shifted without a single raised voice or dramatic announcement. I could still see it clearly. The long glass table, the skyline stretching beyond the windows, the steady presence of people who did not need to prove their authority because it was already understood. I had walked into that room not as someone hoping to be chosen, but as someone who had already been considered, evaluated, and ultimately trusted, and that distinction mattered more than anything that had happened tonight. I remembered the way Richard Reed had watched me as the final documents were placed in front of us, not with skepticism, not with hesitation, but with a kind of measured certainty, the kind that comes from years of experience, from knowing exactly what a person brings into a room before they even speak. He had asked direct questions, the kind that leave no space for vague answers, and I had responded the same way I always had, clearly, precisely, without embellishment, because I had learned long ago that real authority does not rely on volume. It relies on consistency, on the quiet accumulation of decisions made correctly over time. When the final page was signed, there had been no applause, no congratulations that lingered too long, just a simple acknowledgement, a handshake, and a brief conversation about what would come next. Monday morning, a formal announcement, a transition that would ripple through every level of the company, and I had nodded, not because I was surprised, but because I understood exactly what it meant. Not just the title, but the responsibility that came with it. And now, sitting at a round table in a ballroom filled with people who believed they understood hierarchy, I found it almost surreal how separate those two worlds were. Here, status was measured in appearances, in seating arrangements, in who stood where, and who spoke when, but there, it was measured in something entirely different, something that could not be adjusted with the seating chart or softened with a polite smile. I glanced again toward Vanessa, who was now speaking animatedly with a group near the center of the room, her gestures confident, her presence commanding in a way that had likely served her well in spaces like this, and I wondered, not with bitterness but with quiet curiosity, how she would carry herself in a room where confidence alone was not enough, where every word would be weighed, every decision examined, and where the person she had dismissed so easily would be sitting at the head of the table, not as an observer, but as the one setting the direction. I did not rush that thought, did not indulge it beyond what it was, a simple recognition of what was already true, because there was no need to anticipate reactions or imagine outcomes. Those would come on their own, in their own time, and far more effectively than anything I could orchestrate in this moment. I rested my hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding myself again in the present, in the quiet control I had maintained throughout the evening, because while nothing around me had visibly changed, everything that mattered already had, and the difference between those two realities was not something that needed to be explained. It only needed to be seen, and soon enough, it would be it happened in a way that almost no one noticed at first, which made it all the more powerful, a subtle shift in attention near the entrance of the ballroom as a man stepped inside with the kind of presence that did not need introduction. The conversations closest to him softened, then paused, and one by one, people began to turn, not out of obligation, but recognition. I saw him before Vanessa did, Richard Reed, her father, moving through the room with quiet purpose, his posture unchanged, his expression composed in that familiar way that revealed nothing and yet commanded everything. He was not expected to arrive this early. That much was clear from the way Vanessa's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered, smoothing her dress, adjusting her posture, preparing to greet him with the same confidence she had carried all evening. I remained seated, my hands resting calmly in my lap, observing the moment as it unfolded without inserting myself into it, because I did not need to move toward it. It was already moving toward me. Richard greeted a few guests along the way, brief exchanges, polite nods, the kind of interactions that maintained appearances without slowing his pace, and then his gaze shifted, not toward Vanessa, not toward Daniel, but directly across the room, landing on me with unmistakable clarity. There was no hesitation in his expression, no flicker of doubt, only recognition, and in that instant, the space between us seemed to narrow. Despite the distance, I stood then, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw unnecessary attention, but with the same measured composure I had maintained throughout the evening, and as I did, the energy in that part of the room changed in a way that was subtle yet undeniable. Conversations nearby quieted, eyes followed the direction of his movement, and for the first time that night, I was no longer invisible within that space. Richard approached with steady steps, stopping just within arm's reach, and extended his hand with a slight nod that carried far more weight than any introduction could have. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm, assured, exactly as it had been in that office 3 days earlier. "I trust everything is in order." I met his gaze without hesitation, returning the handshake with equal steadiness. "It is," I replied, my tone even, professional, untouched by the context of the evening around us, and for a moment, that was all that needed to be said. No explanation, no elaboration, just a simple exchange that confirmed a reality no one else in that room had yet fully grasped. I could feel it then, the shift, the quiet ripple moving outward as those closest began to piece together what they were witnessing, a greeting that was not social, not familial, but something entirely different, something structured, deliberate, and unmistakably formal. Vanessa reached us a second later, her steps quick but controlled, her expression carefully arranged into something that hovered between curiosity and uncertainty. "Dad," she said lightly, placing a hand on his arm, "I did not know you were coming so early." Her voice carried that same practiced ease, but there was a question beneath it now, a slight edge that had not been there before. Richard acknowledged her with a brief glance, but his attention returned to me almost immediately, and in that small, deliberate choice, everything began to realign. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone once seen. I did not look at Vanessa, not yet, because this moment was not about confrontation. It was about recognition, about the quiet unveiling of something that had already been set into motion long before this evening began. And as I released Richard's hand and resumed my place with the same calm composure I had never once abandoned, I understood that the version of me Vanessa had dismissed so easily no longer existed in this room, and she was only just beginning to realize that Vanessa did not speak right away, and that silence, brief as it was, carried more weight than anything she had said all evening. I could see it in the way her posture shifted ever so slightly, the way her shoulders, once relaxed with confidence, now held a trace of tension that had not been there before. She looked at her father, then at me, and back again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. "Margaret?" she said finally, my name sounding unfamiliar on her tongue, as if she were testing it for the first time, not as a formality, but as a question, and I met her gaze calmly, offering no explanation, no immediate clarification, because this was not a moment that required words from me. It required understanding from her, and that was something she would have to arrive at on her own. Richard remained composed, his presence steady, his attention measured, and when he spoke again, it was not directed at Vanessa, but to the small group that had quietly gathered within earshot. "We will be making a formal announcement on Monday," he said, his tone professional, matter of fact, the kind that did not invite interruption, but I believe some introductions are already overdue. There was a subtle pause then, not long enough to disrupt the flow, but long enough to ensure every word that followed would be heard clearly. "Margaret Collins will be stepping in as the new Chief Executive Officer." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. I did not move, did not react beyond a slight inclination of my head, because I had already accepted that role days ago. This was not news to me. It was simply the moment when it became visible to everyone else. The effect was immediate, though not chaotic. Conversations did not erupt. There were no gasps or raised voices. Instead, there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that travels through a room without needing to announce itself. People straightened, attention sharpened, the tone of the evening adjusting in ways that could not be reversed. Vanessa's expression changed in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone who was not watching closely. Her smile remained, but it no longer reached her eyes. Her gaze fixed on me with a clarity that had been absent before, and in that moment I knew she understood. Not everything, not yet, but enough to recognize that the space she thought she controlled had boundaries she had never considered. "That is surprising," she said carefully, her voice controlled, measured, as if each word had to pass through a new filter before being spoken. I held her gaze, not with challenge, not with triumph, but with quiet steadiness, because there was nothing for me to prove, nothing for me to assert. The truth had already positioned itself exactly where it needed to be. Daniel stood beside her, his expression uncertain, his eyes moving between us as if searching for something familiar and not finding it, and for the first time that evening, he looked at me directly, really looked, not as an afterthought, not as a distant obligation, but as someone he did not fully recognize anymore, and I could see the question forming there. the realization that the version of me he had grown accustomed to no longer fit the reality standing in front of him. I did not answer that question, did not offer him reassurance or explanation, because this was not a moment for comfort. It was a moment for clarity, and clarity does not require explanation, it requires presence. I adjusted my posture slightly, the same composed movement I had made countless times throughout the evening, grounding myself not in the reactions around me, but in the certainty I carried, because while everything in that room had just changed for them, for me, it had already been settled, and now, they were simply catching up to a truth I had been living in for days. No one raised their voice. No one made a scene. And yet everything in that room had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I could feel it in the silence that followed, in the way conversations resumed more cautiously, in the way people now looked at me not with passing acknowledgement but with measured attention, and I remained exactly where I was, seated, composed, untouched by the need to react to any of it, because this was never about proving a point. It was about allowing the truth to exist without interruption. Vanessa stood still for a moment longer than was comfortable, her mind clearly moving through something she had not prepared for, recalibrating, adjusting, searching for footing in a situation where the rules had quietly changed. She took a small step closer, her voice lower now, controlled but no longer effortless. I did not realize, she began and then stopped. As if even that sentence required more care than she expected, I watched her without expression, not cold, not unkind, simply present, because there was nothing for me to correct, nothing for me to soften. Realization is not something that can be given. It must be reached. Daniel shifted beside her, his gaze still fixed on me, uncertainty written in the lines of his face in a way I had not seen since he was much younger, and for a brief moment, I saw the distance between who he had been and who he had become, not as something tragic, but as something inevitable, shaped by choices made over time, choices that now carried weight he could no longer ignore. I stood then, not abruptly, not with any intention of drawing attention, but because the moment had reached its natural conclusion, smoothing my dress with the same quiet precision I had maintained all evening, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, steady, carrying only as far as it needed to. "We will speak on Monday," I said, not looking at Vanessa alone, but at both of them. The words simple, professional, leaving no room for misinterpretation. It was not a threat, not a correction, just a statement of what was already expected, what had already been set into motion. And in that sentence, the entire dynamic between us settled into its new form, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Vanessa nodded slightly, her composure returning in fragments, though not completely. Not yet, because some realizations take longer to fully take hold. Daniel did not speak, but he did not look away either, and that, in its own quiet way, said more than anything else could have. I did not wait for further response, did not extend the moment beyond what was necessary. Instead, I turned with the same measured calm I had carried from the beginning, stepping away from the table, from the conversation, from the version of myself that had once sat quietly at the edge of rooms like this, and as I walked toward the exit, the sounds of the reception continued behind me. Laughter, music, the steady rhythm of a celebration that would carry on exactly as planned, but I understood something they did not. This night would not be remembered for its decorations or its speeches, or even its joy. It would be remembered as the moment when everything quietly changed, not because of what was said, but because of what was finally seen. And as I stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel anger. I felt something far simpler, far steadier. I felt aligned, because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer being placed into a role defined by others. I was standing fully in what I had defined for myself, and that was something no one in that room could take away.